They thought they knew this cathedral inside out. 850 years, every stone studied, every vault measured, every window described in hundreds of academic papers. Then, in 2019, it burned, live on television, in front of 12 million people. And when the fire died down, it turned out that all this time, hidden within the walls of Notre-Dame, was something no historian had suspected. No architect, no scholar across a century and a half of professional research. What exactly? I'm not going to tell you that yet, because if you think you know this story, you don't. If you think the Notre-Dame fire was just a tragedy followed by a restoration, you missed the most important part. What restorers found beneath the layer of ash overturned everything we thought we understood about an entire era. Not about one cathedral, about an era. About people who lived 900 years ago and did something that, according to established science, they were not supposed to be able to do. Stay with this video until the end, not because I'm asking you to, but because after it, you will look at medieval buildings in a completely different way. And because the question this story ends with has no answer yet. People are searching for it right now, in several European cathedrals simultaneously. Stay with us. Let's begin. Some buildings simply stand. Others carry entire epochs on their shoulders. Notre-Dame de Paris belongs to the second category. The trouble is, we had nearly forgotten that. We got used to it, turned the cathedral into a postcard, a selfie backdrop, a waypoint between the Louvre and a cafe terrace. Meanwhile, behind those walls lie 850 years of uninterrupted history that most of us never bothered to read. Construction began in 1163 under Bishop Maurice de Sully. Not under a conquering king, not under a military commander, under a churchman who decided Paris deserved something greater than another Romanesque basilica. The building took nearly 2 centuries to complete. Generations of craftsmen came and went, rulers rose and fell, dynasties collapsed, and the walls kept rising. By 1345, the structure was largely finished. In that span, approximately 10 kings of France had come and gone. This relates to the sheer scale of ambition. Medieval builders did not expect to see the results of their work in their own lifetimes. They laid stones for their grandchildren. That is not a metaphor, it is the literal truth. The architects who broke ground never saw the finished cathedral. And yet, generation after generation maintained a single coherent vision. The question that still troubles historians: how? Without blueprints in any modern sense, without a central coordinating authority, without any means of rapid communication, how did successive generations sustain a level of precision that would impress a modern construction engineer? Notre-Dame is not simply Gothic architecture. It is the first mature example of the Gothic style in Europe. This is where flying buttresses, external stone supports, were first deployed at this scale, allowing walls to become thinner, windows wider, and vaults taller. Before Notre-Dame, churches were dark and low. After it, European architecture was permanently transformed. The cathedrals of Chartres, Reims, Cologne, and Strasbourg all looked to Paris as their reference point. The rose windows of the north and south transepts date to the 13th century. Each measures roughly 13 meters in diameter. The glass is not simply colored. It was produced using techniques that are partially lost to this day. Craftsmen added metallic oxides to the molten material. Copper produced green, cobalt blue, gold red. The precise formulas were kept as closely guarded secrets, passed verbally from master to apprentice. Many of those formulas vanished, along with their keepers during plagues and wars. This is precisely why modern restorers still cannot fully reproduce the original color of a medieval stained glass window. This also applies to the sculpture. The cathedral's facade features 28 statues of the kings of Judah and Israel. During the French Revolution, a mob tore off their heads, mistaking them for French monarchs. The heads were recovered only in 1977, during excavations several blocks from the cathedral. Someone had hidden them. Who exactly? No one knows to this day. Notre-Dame survived the Revolution, 2 world wars, occupation, student uprisings, and 6 different republics. In 1814, a mass was held here to mark Napoleon's abdication. In 1944, on the day Paris was liberated, Charles de Gaulle walked through its nave to the sound of the organ while gunfire still echoed outside. The cathedral is not merely a witness to history, it is an active participant in it. And it was precisely this building, not a museum piece, not a tourist trap, but a living document of 12 centuries of European life that caught fire on live television in full view of millions. 6:51 in the evening. That is when the fire alarm first triggered in the attic of Notre Dame. The security guard on duty went to the wrong location. 23 minutes were lost. By the time the error was discovered and firefighters were called, the blaze had already taken hold of the timber framework. The structure French experts call the forest. Not poetically, literally. Building the roof in the 12th century required felling hectares of woodland. Thousands of oak trees, each 300 to 400 years old at the time of cutting. 800 years later, they ignited within minutes. The first fire crews arrived at 7:08 in the evening. By then, the fire was already beyond containment. Temperature beneath the roof reached 800 degrees Celsius. Spraying water from above was not an option. Helicopters were kept away from the cathedral because a hydraulic impact could have collapsed what was still standing. Firefighters worked from below, through windows, from extending ladders. Nobody could enter the building. Nobody knew when the ceiling would come down. At 7:50, the spire tilted. The lead-covered cone, 93 meters tall, installed by architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc in 1859, had stood for exactly 160 years. On live television, it folded, fell through the roof, and punched through the stone vault below. The hole it opened measured several dozen square meters. Through it, a column of sparks and smoke rose into the Paris night. Thousands of people stood on the streets. Many wept. Some filmed on their phones, and that too is a fact, one worth stating plainly. This relates to what was lost. Within an hour, fire consumed the entire timber roof, approximately 1,300 square meters of medieval construction. The organ, one of the largest in the world, with 8,000 pipes, survived. Most of the stained glass windows held. The crown of thorns and a number of relics were carried out by clergy who formed a human chain and passed the objects hand to hand through the smoke. Each of them knew the building could collapse at any moment. The fire took nearly 9 hours to extinguish. 400 firefighters, 40 vehicles. 2 sustained serious burns. By 3 in the morning, the blaze was contained. The North Tower, which at one point had been considered lost, held. When dawn came, Paris saw what remained: a charred skeleton, open sky above the nave, pools of solidified lead on the floor. The melting point of lead is 327 degrees Celsius. That means the interior had been twice, in places 3 times, hotter than that. This also concerns the scale of contamination. Molten lead from the roof and spire, approximately 400 tons, partially settled on surrounding neighborhoods. Residents of the Ile de la Cité and adjacent streets later reported elevated lead levels in soil and dust. French authorities initially denied the problem. Legal proceedings are ongoing to this day. President Macron promised to rebuild the cathedral within 5 years, by 2024, in time for the Paris Olympics. That promise was kept. In December 2024, Notre-Dame reopened. But during the months that restorers spent clearing the rubble and stabilizing the structure, something happened that no one had anticipated. Not historians, not engineers, not Macron himself. When restoration teams first entered the cathedral after the fire, their task sounded straightforward. Assess the damage, stabilize what remained, draw up a recovery plan. Nobody went in there expecting historical discoveries. Nobody expected to rewrite textbooks. Workers in hard hats and respirators cleared rubble, documented cracks, measured deformations in the stonework. Routine, exhausting, dangerous work. Underfoot, a layer of ash, solidified lead, and charred oak beams. Overhead, open sky where a roof had been for 8 centuries. It was in this environment, amid the dirt, soot, and destruction, that one of the engineers noticed something in the stone masonry. Metallic elements. Small, partially melted, set directly into the joints between limestone blocks. At first, this attracted little interest. Metal in old buildings is not unusual. Brackets, anchors, clamps added during later restorations. Viollet-le-Duc made extensive use of metal components during his 19th century reconstruction. A logical explanation, simple, convenient. It turned out to be wrong. When metal samples were sent for analysis, the dating results came back with an unexpected answer. The iron staples had been produced in the 12th century, not the 19th, not the 17th, the 12th, meaning during the original construction of the cathedral, roughly between 1163 and 1250. This relates to what had been considered impossible. Most historians of architecture and metallurgy held that the systematic use of iron in large-scale stone construction in Western Europe did not begin until the late Middle Ages and became widespread only in the era of industrialization. The 12th century did not fit that picture. The staples were not found in one location, not in 2. They were discovered throughout the entire perimeter of the cathedral, in arches, in column capitals, in the joints between stone blocks at points of maximum structural load. This is not a random detail added by some enterprising craftsman. It is a system, a deliberate, consistent, engineered system of reinforcing a stone structure with metal connectors. Medieval builders did not merely know about the properties of iron, they applied it with intent, precisely where stone alone could not handle the load. This relates to the quality of the metal itself. Analysis revealed that the iron was not crude. It had been heat-treated, subjected to a process that modern metallurgy calls normalization, heating to a specific temperature, holding, controlled cooling. This improves the grain structure of the metal, making it less brittle and more resistant to deformation. Slag was removed through repeated hammering. The shape of each staple was chosen to suit its specific structural joint. Some were straight, others curved, others had widened ends for better bonding with the stone. This is not improvisation on a building site. These are pre-designed components. The paradox is that the fire itself made the discovery possible. The extreme heat burned and partially destroyed the lime mortar surrounding the staples and exposed them to view. Under normal circumstances, they would have remained hidden within the masonry for centuries more. The fire that destroyed the roof simultaneously stripped away the surface logic of the walls and revealed the inner logic beneath. Notre-Dame effectively disassembled itself to show how it had been assembled. And here is what is genuinely unsettling. The cathedral had been studied professionally for a century and a half. Following Viollet-le-Duc's mid-19th century restoration, the building was examined by architects, historians, engineers, and art historians. Detailed survey drawings exist, photographic archives, academic monographs, and not one specialist in 150 years had found what the restoration teams found in 2019 beneath a layer of ash. Because they had been looking at the cathedral from the outside, the fire showed it from within. The initial response from the academic community was entirely predictable. Not excitement, not sensation, skepticism. Professional, methodical, fully justified skepticism. Historians and metallurgists who were informed of the dating results reacted in much the same way. There must be an error. Radiocarbon analysis has a margin of error. Samples may have been contaminated. The fire may have altered the isotopic composition of the metal. There were enough grounds for doubt, and the scientists used them, as they should have. A second round of analysis was conducted. Samples were taken from different points throughout the cathedral, from staples of different shapes and sizes, from different structural joints. Several independent dating methods were applied, including analysis of metal composition and comparison of the forging technique with samples from other French 12th century structures. The results converged. Every sample pointed to the same period, the early and middle medieval era, the time of Notre Dame's original construction. Not one sample dated to later than the 13th century. At first, the explanation was coincidence. Perhaps an individual craftsman ahead of his time had used iron in a few locations on his own initiative. That happens in the history of technology, solitary figures who invent something before it becomes standard practice. Then, when the number of staples proved too large for coincidence, the theory shifted. Perhaps this was a local tradition specific to Parisian building guilds of the period. But when it became clear that the metal connectors were distributed systematically, at points of maximum load, at structural junctions, with evident attention to force distribution, both explanations collapsed. This was not one craftsman, and this was not a local tradition. This was an engineering decision built into the design from the beginning. This relates to what the staples were actually doing. In Gothic architecture, the central problem is thrust. Arches and vaults generate horizontal forces that push outward against the walls. It was precisely to counteract these forces that flying buttresses were invented, the external stone supports that became the defining image of the Gothic style. But flying buttresses work on the outside. The iron staples worked on the inside. They locked stone blocks together at critical points, preventing the structure from opening under load. Together with the flying buttresses, they formed a double system, external and internal, that held the cathedral in equilibrium for 8.5 centuries. The internal half of that system was unknown until 2019. Imagine disassembling an old mechanical clock and finding inside it components that, according to every textbook, could not have existed in clocks of that era. Not because the maker was a lone genius, but because it turns out the technology existed, was applied, worked, yet was never documented in a form that survived to the present day. That is approximately what happened with Notre-Dame. For 8 centuries, the cathedral stood and said nothing about how it was built. It took a fire to make it speak. This relates to the condition of the metal after the fire. The 800-degree temperature to which the staples were subjected during the blaze should have destroyed them, or at minimum caused serious damage. Iron at that temperature softens, loses shape, oxidizes rapidly. Yet most of the staples retained their structural integrity. This produced another surprise for metallurgists. The quality of the medieval wrought iron was sufficient to survive a thermal event that completely destroyed modern lead structures. The 19th century lead spire melted entirely. The 12th century iron staples held. Academic papers resulting from the research were published in several leading journals on architectural history and material science. The authors were careful in their phrasing, as is customary in academic work. But the substance of their conclusions was unambiguous. The medieval builders of Notre-Dame possessed iron-working technology at a level that was not assumed to exist in the 12th century. They did not merely know how to forge metal, they knew how to engineer it, calculate loads, select forms, integrate it into the structure so that metal and stone work together as a system rather than as separate elements. The fire that destroyed the roof and spire effectively stripped the upper layer from the cathedral and revealed what lay beneath. Charred beams disappeared, and the walls became visible. Damaged mortar crumbled, and metal emerged from the masonry. Thermal stress deformed the surface and exposed the structure beneath. Destruction functioned as a kind of scan. It did not simply break the object, it illuminated it from within. And inside, there was considerably more than the outside had ever suggested. The term Dark Ages was not coined in the Middle Ages. It was coined during the Renaissance by people who considered themselves heirs to antiquity and looked back on the preceding 8 centuries as a collapse in history, a period during which Europe had allegedly regressed, fallen silent, and stopped thinking. It was an act of intellectual arrogance dressed up as a historical concept. And that concept proved so convenient, so well suited to the narrative of progress and enlightenment, that it survived several revolutions, several wars, and arrived in 21st century school textbooks almost intact. The iron staples in the walls of Notre-Dame are one more nail in the coffin of that myth. Not the first, and almost certainly not the last. To create the metal reinforcement system that restorers discovered, the 12th century builders needed several things simultaneously. First, a reliable source of quality iron. Second, the technology to process it, forging, thermal normalization, shaping to precise dimensions. Third, an engineering understanding of exactly where that metal was needed and why. Fourth, an organizational structure capable of supplying all of this at the required scale over decades of construction. None of these elements could exist in isolation. All of them require a system: economic, educational, professional. This relates to where the iron came from. In the 12th century, the principal producers of quality iron in Europe were regions corresponding to present-day Germany, Spain, and northern Italy. French builders obtained metal through trade networks that had been functioning for several centuries by that point. The Champagne fairs, the largest commercial hub in medieval Europe, were located approximately 150 kilometers from Paris. Through them passed goods from Flanders, the Iberian Peninsula, Lombardy, and the Baltic coast. Iron was one of the key commodities in this trade. The builders of Notre-Dame did not isolate themselves in Paris and invent things from nothing. They operated within an extensive European economy that supplied them with materials, tools, and in all likelihood, knowledge. Metalworking technology in medieval Europe had complex and layered origins. Arab craftsmen working in Spain and Sicily transmitted knowledge of tempering and steel processing that traced back to traditions of the Middle East and Central Asia. Byzantine craftsmen preserved and developed the traditions of late Roman metallurgy. Monastic workshops, particularly in the Benedictine and Cistercian orders, were not merely religious institutions, but centers of technological production, where smithing, stoneworking, and structural engineering were taught as part of a craft education. When Bernard of Clairvaux, in the 12th century, described a Cistercian monastery as a place where monks worked with their hands no less than they prayed, he was recording reality, not an ideal. The medieval monastery was a production enterprise, with workshops, a library, a school, and a system for transmitting knowledge across generations. This relates to the question of how knowledge was transmitted at all. We tend to think of medieval education as something chaotic and informal. An apprentice watches a master, the master demonstrates, the apprentice repeats. No drawings, no calculations, no written instructions. This picture is only partially accurate. Medieval building guilds, known as lodges, from the French word for the temporary structure beside a cathedral wall where craftsmen worked and lived, had their own systems of professional training, their own rules of admission and advancement, their own trade secrets. A master builder of the 12th century directing the construction of a major cathedral was not merely a skilled craftsman. He was an engineer, an administrator, a project manager, and the custodian of a technological tradition all at once. The portfolio of Villars de Honnecourt, a manuscript by a 13th century French architect that has survived to the present day, contains drawings of construction machinery, geometric calculations, and diagrams of structural solutions. This is not the notebook of an enthusiastic amateur. It is a professional technical document. The discovery of staples in Notre-Dame fits into a broader picture that historians have been gradually assembling over the past 30 years. The Middle Ages were not a period of stagnation. Between the year 1000 and 1350, before the onset of the plague, the population of Europe doubled. Cities grew, trade expanded. The number of large stone structures erected during this period has no parallel in antiquity or in any subsequent century before the Industrial Revolution. In France alone, between 1050 and 1350, approximately 80 major cathedrals and 500 large churches were built or substantially rebuilt. Building one Notre-Dame required roughly 2 centuries and the labor of thousands of people. Multiply that by 80 and you begin to grasp the scale of the medieval French construction industry. This relates to what drove this building, not religious impulse alone, though that was certainly present. Building a cathedral was simultaneously an act of urban politics, an economic project, and a technological competition. Cities competed with one another over the height of vaults and the elegance of construction. Reims wanted to surpass Chartres. Amiens wanted to surpass Reims. Beauvais attempted to build the tallest Gothic vault in history. 60 meters, and in 1284 the vault collapsed. This was not the tragedy of blasphemers, as preachers of the time explained it. It was an engineering experiment that went too far. Medieval builders were pushing the limits of what was possible, and sometimes those limits pushed back. To speak of the Middle Ages as an era of ignorance is to ignore all of this. It means closing one's eyes to the fact that people without computers, without engineering institutions, without standardized systems of measurement, built structures that stand to this day, and that contemporary engineers study with genuine respect. The iron staples of Notre-Dame are not a curiosity or an exception. They are evidence. Evidence that the era we find it convenient to call dark was considerably more illuminated than we have been accustomed to believe. There is a question that rarely gets asked out loud, but which underlies almost every conversation about the Middle Ages. It goes something like this: how could they have built anything at all if they were so primitive? The question is flawed, but it persists. It is embedded in the very structure of how we are accustomed to think about historical progress, a line pointing upward, from primitive to complex, from ignorance to knowledge, from the past to us. We are the summit, they were the base. Everything that came before us is a rough draft. Everything we will become is the final version. It is a convenient framework, and it is almost entirely wrong. Human intelligence has not evolved over the past 1,000 years. The brain of a person in the 12th century was organized in exactly the same way as the brain of a person in the 21st. The same neural structures, the same capacity for abstract thought, for planning, for solving complex problems, for transmitting knowledge. The difference is not in cognitive ability. The difference is in tools and in the accumulated volume of information a person has access to. The craftsman who calculated the load-bearing requirements for a stone vault at Notre-Dame without a computer and without an engineering textbook did not accomplish that in spite of his era. He accomplished it because of his era, because of the system of knowledge that existed around him, even if in a form entirely unlike anything we are accustomed to. This relates to how we read history at all. Most people know about the Middle Ages from what films have shown them. Dirt, plague, Inquisition, superstition. These images are not invented. They reflect real phenomena. But they reflect those phenomena with the same accuracy as a film about contemporary life shot exclusively in prisons, psychiatric hospitals, and landfill sites. Technically accurate, essentially a caricature. Notre-Dame, Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Cologne Cathedral, the palaces of Venice, the baptisteries of Florence. All of this is also the Middle Ages. All of this is also the product of the labor of people from that era. And when we look at these buildings, we should ask ourselves an honest question. What, among the things we have built in the 20th and 21st centuries, will still be standing in 800 years? Reinforced concrete structures, which are today considered the standard of construction, have a design service life of between 50 and 100 years. This is not a secret, it is an engineering given. Rebar corrodes, concrete cracks, structures require constant maintenance and periodic replacement. Most buildings constructed in the 20th century will not survive the 22nd. Meanwhile, wrought iron set into the walls of Notre-Dame lay in stone for 850 years and survived a fire at 800 degrees Celsius. This is not nostalgia for the past. It is an engineering fact that is difficult to argue with. This also relates to how we treat what has been passed down to us. The restoration of Notre-Dame placed architects before a question that sounds simple in theory and proved extremely difficult in practice. How do you restore something you do not fully understand? How do you reconstruct a roof when the technology for producing medieval oak beams has been lost? How do you replace stained glass when the formulas for medieval glass have not survived? The French restorers made several fundamental decisions. First, to preserve original materials wherever they had survived. Second, for new construction, to seek not merely analogues, but precise technological equivalents. Third, to document every phase of the work with such thoroughness that in 100 years, the next generation of restorers would understand exactly what had been done and why. This is a lesson that medieval builders, by all evidence, understood better than we do. What you build today is not for you, it is for those who come after. For those of us in the 21st century, accustomed to speed and to constant renewal, this logic does not come naturally. We live in a culture that devalues the old and overvalues the new by default. A new phone is better than last year's. A new version of the software is better than the previous one. A new concept is smarter than the old one. This principle works in consumer technology. It fails catastrophically when applied to historical heritage. Because what was made in the 12th century and has stood for 850 years is not an artifact that can be replaced with an improved version. It is an original that exists in a single instance and has no substitute. Stone speaks. Iron speaks. They speak in a language we have largely forgotten how to listen to, the language of loads and stresses, of forms and proportions, of material choice and precision of execution. When a restorer touches a 12th century staple and understands that it was placed exactly here, in exactly this shape, as the result of an engineering calculation, that is not romance and not mysticism. It is a conversation across 8 centuries. A conversation between two people who never met, but who thought about the same problem. And one of them solved it so well that his solution survived a fire. Notre-Dame does not offer us occasion for sentimentality. It offers us occasion for a serious conversation about what we consider progress, what we consider knowledge, and what we are prepared to pass on to those who will live after us. The medieval builders did not know they were building for eternity. They simply built as though they were building for eternity. The difference between those two things is small, and in that difference, everything. In December 2024, Notre-Dame reopened. 5 years of restoration, approximately €7 billion in donations from private individuals, corporations, and governments around the world, more than 2,000 specialists, architects, engineers, stonemasons, glaziers, restorers, historians, metallurgists. The spire was recreated from Viollet-le-Duc's original drawings. The roof was rebuilt. The stained glass was cleaned. The organ was restored. The cathedral stands again above the Seine, almost as those who saw it before the fire remember it. Almost, but not quite. Because Notre-Dame after 2019 is already a different object. Not in terms of its physical construction, but in terms of what we know about it. The fire stripped from it the patina of familiarity that accumulates on any monument that has stood long enough to become background. We look at old buildings and do not see them. We see postcards, logos, tourist itineraries. Notre-Dame burned for 5 hours on live television, and the world suddenly saw a building. A real building, with its weight, its age, its fragility and its strength simultaneously. This relates to the nature of catastrophe as an instrument of knowledge. history knows many cases where destruction revealed what preservation had concealed. Pompeii was buried under the ash of Vesuvius, and precisely for that reason gave us the most precise cross-section of Roman life in the 1st century. London burned in 1666, and precisely for that reason, during excavations for new foundations, layers of Roman and medieval city were uncovered that would otherwise have lain untouched beneath the paving. Dresden, after the bombardment of 1945, yielded medieval underground passages during the clearing of rubble, passages unknown to contemporaries. Destruction is not only loss. It is sometimes the only way to see what has been carefully hidden by time, by layers of later construction, and by ordinary human inattention. Notre-Dame occupies a particular place in this sequence, because what the fire revealed, 12th-century iron staples, is not merely a fact about one specific building. It is a question about a system, about who taught the builders of Notre-Dame to work with iron in the way they did, about where the school existed in which this knowledge arose and took form, about whether other buildings of the same era were constructed on the same principle and simply have not yet experienced a catastrophe that would allow this to be discovered. This relates to the fact that the research is not complete. Following the publication of the results of the staple analysis, several European research groups began examining other Gothic cathedrals for analogous elements. Preliminary findings from Chartres and Bourges suggest the possible presence of similar metal connectors in the masonry. If confirmed, the discussion would no longer concern a unique feature of Notre-Dame, but an entire engineering tradition whose existence had not previously been recorded in historical scholarship. A tradition that arose, developed, was applied in the largest construction projects of medieval Europe, and disappeared without leaving written traces sufficient for historians of subsequent centuries to know of it. Disappeared, but not without trace. It remained in stone, in iron, in the proportions of vaults and in the precise placement of each staple. It waited 850 years and waited long enough for a fire to expose it. Those who today work on the restoration and study of medieval cathedrals face a task that has no precedent. It is not a building that needs to be reconstructed. The building has already been restored. It is knowledge that needs to be reconstructed. To understand exactly how medieval craftsmen calculated the placement of metal connectors, to determine whether there existed a written or oral tradition for transmitting these calculations, to establish where the iron-working technology used in the construction of Notre-Dame originated, from monastic workshops, from Arab Spain, from Byzantium, or whether it developed independently from local experience. To answer the question of why this knowledge was not passed on, or whether it was passed on, but in a form we no longer recognize. None of these questions yet has a definitive answer. This is not a weakness of scholarship. It is scholarship's normal condition at the frontier of research, when a new fact demolishes an old picture and the new picture has not yet taken shape. It is precisely at this point, between what we already know and what we do not yet know, that real history is found. Notre-Dame was built by people, specific people, with names that in most cases have not survived, with biographies unknown to us, with tools that rotted or rusted away centuries ago. We do not know who exactly decided to set iron staples into stone in 1163. We do not know whether it was the chief architect or one of the master craftsmen, or a person whose name was never recorded in any document at all. We do not know whether he understood that he was doing something unusual or considered it a self-evident practice. We do not know whether he taught others, and whether that knowledge reached those who built the next cathedral. We know only the result. 850 years in stone, a fire survived. And the question that now stands before us with the same force as at the moment of discovery: how it was done, and above all, by whom. If you watched until this moment, it means you care. It means history for you is not a list of dates in a textbook, but a living substance that keeps speaking to us through stone, iron, and fire. This channel exists for exactly those people. Leave a like. It is the only way to tell the algorithm that videos like this one matter. Subscribe if you have not already. There is more ahead that will challenge more than one assumption you thought was settled. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next episode, because the next story will be no less unexpected. That is a promise.